In Ruth 1, verses 6 through 22, but just listen to the narrative here. Listen to the story as it unfolds. And so I'm going to read the word for us. So hear the word of the Lord. Ruth 1, verse 6. Then she arose, this is Naomi, she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord is gone forth against me." And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Let's pray together. God, as we open your word to look at the book of Ruth, help us to learn to see beauty in the ashes. Help us to learn to see your sovereign hand in the midst of sorrow and pain. Help us to trust you, Lord. Guide us now as we look at your word. Amen. So the story of Ruth is tough. First chapter is full of just pain. What we just read, you continue to feel this pain. And we'd like to think that this is unusual in the Bible, but actually it's much more common than we'd like to even assume. As we read through the Bible, we find story after story after story of just pain and hurt and difficulty, but we also find the story of God working in the midst of it. God's presence in the midst of the brokenness of humanity. And so, as we read the Bible, I hope we see that Ruth is a small picture of what's going on in the bigger picture of the Bible. And I thought this week in my preparation, last week we talked about Joseph. Looking back, we looked at Joseph's life and how God was working in the midst of that. This week I thought about, into the New Testament of Jesus' teaching, I thought about the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. And the story of the prodigal son, if you don't know it, I'll retell it quickly just for our purposes here. Jesus tells the story of a son that goes to his father and says, "I want my inheritance now." While you're still alive. He goes to his dad and says, while you're still alive. Something that would be unheard of in that time. Something that would even be considered shameful today. And the father gives him his inheritance. The son leaves and goes off to a foreign land and wastes all the money. Famine comes, he finds himself working in the pigsty, working in the pig pen. Pigs were unclean in the Jewish faith. So he found himself in one of the least likely places, one of the places that he never would have wanted to be. He ends up in the pig pen. And he finds himself so hungry that he even considers eating the pig food. And he remembered in that moment, he said, even in my father's home, the servants are treated better than this. The servants are treated well. And he says, I'll return home to my father, not as a son, but as a servant. So he begins his trip home. And I'm sure the whole way home, he was practicing his I'm sorry speech. Sorry for losing all your money. Sorry for everything that I've done wrong. Sorry for abandoning you. But while he's still a ways off, his father sees him. His father runs to him. And before his son can even finish his I'm sorry speech, the father says, no. Get his robe, get his ring, and kill the fatted calf. For my son was dead, but is now found alive. He was lost, but is found. And in many ways, that's the story of Ruth, and that's the story of the Bible. That humanity has gone away from God and tried to do it our own way and sinned and disobeyed against a holy and perfect God. Yet we have a loving and gracious God that is waiting for us to welcome us home, not as servants, but as sons and daughters. And in many ways, that's what we see in Ruth. We talked about last week how Ruth disobeyed. Naomi and her family disobeyed, not Ruth specifically, but Naomi and her family disobeyed. They went to the land of Moab. Her sons, Naomi's sons, married Moabite women. The husband and the two sons die. And we see today, Naomi begins her path home. Returning home to Judah, but not just Judah, to the people of God and to God himself, to Yahweh, the one true God. And so when we think about this story today, we have to think about it in that context. And so, as I always like to do, I always like to try to summarize our passage in one big idea or one statement. And if I could do that, what I would say for this passage is, like Ruth, we have two choices. Follow God or try another way. So often we go for the latter, right? We say, I'll try it another way. And in many ways, that's what you see from Naomi and their family in the beginning of chapter 1, is they said, we'll try it another way. But as we'll see in our passage today, Ruth is left with a moment where she has the choice to follow God, to follow Yahweh, the one true God, or to try it another way. So really, that's the big idea. That's our option as we think about this. And so I want us to think about this story. In many ways, the book of Ruth, it almost reads like a play. It's almost all conversation. So it's one person talking to another, and it's this ongoing conversation, and you have these scenes that appear, one scene after another. Last week we looked at the setting. We looked at kind of this beginning scene, the death of Naomi's husband and two sons. And then today we look at two scenes. We'll look at the scene of Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah on their journey back to Bethlehem, and then we'll see Naomi's return actually to Bethlehem. And so let's look first at her journey home. And this is in verses 6 through 18. So it's rather long. We'll actually break it down into three sections. Because on this journey home, you see Naomi has three different conversations with Ruth and Orpah. And so, we ended last week in verses 6 and 7. And just briefly, I want us to just notice, in the midst of Naomi's sorrow, in the midst of Naomi's brokenness of death of her husband and two sons, she hears news that the famine's over in the land of Judah, that God himself had visited his people. And so we ended last week saying that Naomi says, well, it obviously didn't work here, so I'll go back to my people, the people of God, to God himself, because it obviously didn't work out here. And it says in verse 7, so she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went out on the way to return to the land of Judah. And so the two daughter-in-laws are with her, and then you see here in verse 8 and 9, you see this first conversation that appears. Naomi stops, and I'm sure at this point on the way home, she begins to realize what the future would hold for her daughters-in-law. Moabite women going to Judah, the people of God, they would be outcasts. Their opportunities would be minimal. No longer married, and the prospect of remarriage very small for them. And it's like she realizes this, and so she pauses in verse 8, and she said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. There's a lot of debate amongst scholars as to why she says, go to your mother's house. Culturally in that day, you would have expected her to say, go to your father's house because of a patriarchal society. But she says, go to your mother's house. And the best explanation I could find as to why she says this, most likely she's saying to them because the mother often helped the daughters to prepare themselves for marriage. And most likely she's saying, go to your mother's house to prepare yourselves to get remarried in Moab. She's saying, it's better for you to go back to Moab and get married there. You have a chance to get remarried there. And then here she has almost like a mini prayer for them. May the Lord, and the Lord here, anytime we see this in the Old Testament, when we see the Lord, it's actually a reference to Yahweh, the name of God that we have, but they often found it as too holy to write. And so when we see the Lord in all caps like this, it's oftentimes a reference to Yahweh, the one true God. And so here she's saying, may Yahweh, may the Lord. She's not talking about a Moab God here. She's talking about the one true God. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. She uses a word here for kindly. It'll be a theme throughout the rest of the book. It carries with it in the Greek this idea of loving kindness. May the loving kindness of the Lord be with you. And we'll see through the rest of the book, it kind of guides the rest of this, that we're seeing the loving kindness of the Lord in the midst of this brokenness, in the midst of this turmoil, in the midst of the unknown. And so Naomi says here, she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you, because just as you have been kind to me and my sons who are now dead. And then she says in verse 9, may the Lord grant that you find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. She continues this kind of prayer for them. She says, and may the Lord grant that you find rest. Because she understands the future for them, if they go back to Judah, will not be rest. It will be full of difficulty and unknown. They won't know where their food will come from. They won't know how they will provide for themselves. And she says, I pray that you go find a husband and you have rest. And actually this word rest carries with it this idea of a long-term dwelling. You find longevity in the home of a new husband. So you see and feel the pain of this here. And then it says, and then she kissed them. And most scholars say this is kind of her saying goodbye to them. She's encouraging them. She says, it's better not to stay with me. It's better for you to go. But imagine the pain and the difficulty of this for Naomi here, because she's already lost her husband, her two sons, and now she's encouraging the only two people still in her life, her daughters-in-law. She says, for your good, it's better for you to go home. This was family for her. This was family for them. And so she kissed them as in many ways to say goodbye. And it says, and they lifted up their voices and wept. The tears began to flow. And with that, this is more than just a few tears. It actually carries with it the idea of wailing together. They sat down and had a good cry together. And so from here, we get to conversation number 2. After they have a good cry, they finally stop crying enough to say to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." They said, "No, no, we can't abandon you. We'll go with you." And her response here is another attempt to convince them to go. In verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands?'" Okay, so it's important for us to understand here when she says this, is she's pointing out a couple of things very, very specifically about the people of God in the Old Testament. So there was this idea of levirate marriage. And this idea of levirate marriage was this idea that if I died, my brother would continue the line if there was not a male heir to continue my lineage. My brother would marry my wife to continue the line. And so most likely that's what she's referencing here when she says, "Do I have another son?" She says, "No, I don't have any more. No more in my womb. So why would you stay with me? I have no prospect of marriage, no levirate marriage for you to continue the line." And she continues in verse 12, "Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying?" He says, "No, my daughters." He says, "Even if I had a husband, even if I had more sons, would you wait until they were old enough to marry? You yourselves would probably be past the age to have kids at that point." And so she's encouraging them, saying, understand this, but it's not just that. She's saying, but understand if you go back with me, your only option for marriage is through this levirate marriage law. She said, most likely no one would marry you because you are an outsider. You're a Moabite. You're not identified with the people of God. And so she's saying, count the cost of what it means to go back with me. In many ways, it's a life of hardship, a life of difficulty. And she says, it's better for you to go back to Moab where you have a chance to find another husband. And then she ends and she says, "No, my daughters, for it's harder for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." And actually here, when it says, "for it's harder for me than for you," literally this could be translated as, "it's more bitter for me than for you." This word of bitterness appears again in just a moment. But it's the first time that you kind of get a glimpse into Naomi's heart. Naomi is broken. She's a bit bitter at this point. She doesn't understand. So often we find ourselves in that very same kind of situation. I don't understand why this happened. Why now? Why this? Why this circumstance? Why God? And here she says to them, she says, me asking you to leave, don't worry, it's more bitter for me because you have an opportunity for a full life still. She said, but if you leave, it actually leaves me alone with no prospect of anyone to take care of me in my old age. No one to care for me, no one to be with me, no one to bury me when I die. So she says, it's more bitter for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And so here you see, and some commentators have taken the position that Naomi is blaming God here. I don't quite see that when I read this passage. Instead, I see the response of a woman in trauma, in the unknown, in the difficulty of that. And she says, almost as if this is all somehow my fault, as if she's the problem. She says, no, go far away from me, for the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So she's saying, I don't see any hope. I don't see any opportunity. I don't see a way. It's harder. It's more bitter for me than for you. So we're met with this brokenness, right? And really the first chapter, that's all through the whole first chapter of Ruth, that's what we see. We see pain, we see sorrow. And you continue to think, is there any hope? Thankfully, we get to keep reading. But it doesn't get better right away. And so at this point, we move to their third conversation. And it actually says in verse 14, it says, and they lifted up their voices and wept again. So they sat together and had another good cry. Tears are part of life. So often as Christians, we try to act like we're just supposed to act tough and smile all the time, even when it hurts. But there are times that actually it's helpful for us to cry, to sit together and mourn with one another. And this was one of those cases where they sat and they went, this is potentially the end of a family. The separation of a family, and they cried. They wept together. And I take heart, and I'm reminded of even Jesus, when Jesus, even though he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, he saw the pain and the hurt of death, and Jesus himself wept. And here, these women weep together, wail together. And as they dry their tears, Orpah this time kisses Naomi and leaves. This was her goodbye now. And there have been many commentators that have acted like Orpah was just, how could she make this decision? But the truth is, she was listening to her mother-in-law, the head of the family at this point, who's encouraging her to go. And even if she didn't want to, she chose to listen and obey. But the downside of this is she leaves the people of God, Yahweh, the one true God. And this is the end of the story for Orpah. She falls off the pages of Scripture, and it's the last we hear of her. And so she goes back to her people, to her gods. Heartbroken, sorrowful. But what does Ruth do here? It says, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth said, no, you're not getting rid of me that easily. And then Naomi, once again, this is her third and final attempt to convince Ruth to go back. She now uses Orpah as the example. And now Naomi is just speaking directly to Ruth, and she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Naomi says to Ruth, no. Look, Orpah's gone back. You do the same. It's better for you. Just go. And then we have here what is one of the most beautiful passages in all of the Scriptures, in my opinion. We have Ruth's response. And Ruth said, and this is really the first time, a book that's named after her, where most of the way through the first chapter, this is the first time we hear directly from Ruth. And this is what she says. Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. So Ruth, finally, we hear from her directly. She says, no, I won't go. She says, where you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. She says, I identify myself with you, with your people, and with your God. And commentators, usually when they read this, they take one of two options here. They take one of two perspectives. And one says that Ruth is only attaching herself to Naomi. This is obedience to Naomi and Naomi alone. They say she's following Naomi, and as a byproduct, she also follows God. And other people come to this and they say, no, this is actually her declaration of faith. This isn't following Naomi. This is simply following God. And she's identifying herself with God and his people. And they usually take one of those two approaches, and I say, why can't both be true at the same time? Where Ruth is identifying herself with Naomi and saying, I'll go where you go, but she's also in the process identifying herself with God, with Yahweh, the one true God. And what she's doing here is even in the midst of Naomi's brokenness, even in the midst of this pain, Ruth has seen something in her, a trust in Yahweh, in the one true God, that he's working in the midst of this brokenness, in the midst of this pain, that she's looking to him for guidance. She's going back to Bethlehem in the midst of all of this brokenness. She's going home to the people of God and to Yahweh, the one true God. So I actually think that both are occurring here. She's telling Naomi, no, I will be faithful to you. But she's also saying, at the same time, I will identify myself with the people of God and with God himself. And why do I say that? Why do I say that she's identifying herself with the people of God and with God himself? Because she says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Okay, to us that may mean absolutely nothing, but in that day, that was a statement of identification. If she had said, I'll stay with you until you die, and then I'll go back to my people, that's her saying, I'm just committing to you, Naomi, for this time period. But when she says, actually, where you die, I will die, and I will be buried there. Burial was a point of identification, not just with a people, but with the God. And so her saying, actually, I want to be buried there, she said, I no longer identify as a Moabite. I no longer identify with the Moabite gods. She said, I identify with the people of God and with God himself, with Yahweh, the one true God. So here, this is Ruth's kind of moment of committing to Naomi, but also to the people of God and to God himself. She says, thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And Naomi, at this point in verse 18, she realizes there's no convincing her. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. She said, fine, let's go. So Naomi was simply, to the best of my understanding, trying to, the best of my knowledge of this, she was trying to convince them to take a life that gave them more opportunity. And Ruth said, no, I'll take my chances with you, with the people of God, and with God himself. So they return, Ruth and Naomi. Orpah leaves, and that's the last we hear of Orpah. So the scene changes now. You've had these three conversations. We now just have Ruth and Naomi, and the scene changes, and they're actually arriving in Bethlehem. And so now we see Naomi's return to Bethlehem in verses 19 through 22. Verse 19, it says, so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? So Ruth and Naomi now return to Bethlehem, to Naomi's home. And it says when they arrived, all the city was stirred. In the States, we would say, they became the talk of the town. Suddenly the whole town was saying, wait, who is that? Is this Naomi? Where's her husband? Where are her two sons? Who's this woman that's with her? And if you grew up in a big city, you may say, I don't get that. But if you grew up in a small town or a small village, you probably understand this here. When I go home, I'm from a small area, and oftentimes I will be home for just a few hours. I'll go to the grocery store, and I'll have a friend of mine call me that says, hey, my aunt saw you at the grocery store. How long have you been here? How long are you going to be here? You know, I don't have to be there long before someone in my hometown knows I'm already there. And in many ways, that's what happened here. They're saying, wait, Naomi's back. Where's her family? Is this Naomi? She looks a little different. She looks a little downcast. It's not the same person we saw when she left. And we get her response here. They say, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And once again, this gives us a picture into her heart at this time. This gives us a picture into the sorrow, into the pain that she's feeling. Because what she's doing here is she's using these names and the meanings behind their names. Naomi means pleasant. She says, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. But don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. And she says, for the Almighty, a designation of the one true God, a name for him, the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Once again, going back to what she said earlier, the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. She doesn't understand it all, but she feels that somehow within this is the Lord acting in the midst of this. She gives no explanation as to why or what or whose fault it was, but we feel and see the brokenness. And then in verse 21, I referenced this last week. She says, I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. She said, we left to go to Moab seeking a better life. We left full family, full of opportunity. She said, and yet I return with nothing. She said, it's me and my daughter-in-law, a Moabite woman. And so she says, why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? She said, don't call me pleasant. So you feel the pain. You feel the hurt. You feel the difficulty here where she's struggling with this. But I want us to note something here. She's back in Bethlehem. She's back with the people of God. She's back in the region and the people that God has promised to take care of. In the Old Testament, there was a specific people, the people of God, the people of Israel. And even though she didn't understand, she's there. Even though she's a bit broken, even though she's hurting, even though she's bitter, she's there. She's not claiming to understand. She's not even claiming to fully believe at this point. And really, you probably see some of her kind of struggles with her faith in suggesting for Orpah and Ruth to return to their gods in Moab. But she's still there, and I want us to see that God is not done with her yet. He still has a plan for her. He still has a use for her. He still has much to do in her life. And I want us to notice how often this book feels so normal. It doesn't feel overly spiritual. You just feel like you're just watching a bit of a TV show like, man, that's a tough day for these people. And yet, as we'll see, God in his sovereign hand is directing their steps because he has a bigger plan and a purpose in the midst of the brokenness. So Naomi returned in verse 22 with her, Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. So here you see this designation of Ruth the Moabitess. In many ways, this was like a term of prejudice. Oh, by the way, that's the outsider. And you'll see this designation over and over again. And so now it's exactly what Naomi had warned Ruth about, that you will be viewed as this outsider through the rest of your time here. But in the midst of all of this pain, sorrow, and hurt, we get a glimmer of hope. Just as last week we got a glimmer of hope where it says, the Lord had provided bread in the house of bread back in Judah, in Bethlehem. And so they returned home, and now they get back to Bethlehem, and what does it say? At the end of verse 22, it says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. It says, and they appear, and they had heard that there was food, and as they get there, it's harvest time. In Bethlehem, the house of bread has bread again. And so you think, well, it's been really bad, so food at least sounds nice. And we get another glimmer of hope. And at this point I say, what's next for these two women? What does God have in store? The truth is, God's not done with them yet, and we have to wait until next week to see. But I want us to understand when we read this, let's enjoy the story even in the midst of the pain. Let's appreciate how God has even used these normal people in what feel like normal events. And yes, it's tragic normal events, but it's part of life. To see how God is working and moving in the midst of these people, in the midst of Naomi and Ruth. So next week, we move to another scene. It's now the barley harvest. And we get a new character that enters the story, Boaz. Who is this character? What is his role? And so, that's where we'll look next week. But as I always like to do, I always like to try to apply this passage to our lives. How do we begin to think about application? So I have a few questions for us as we think about application before we close. Have the circumstances of life made you bitter? We've been through a couple of years of pandemic. I've had a lot of questions from people all over the world that have said, why? What? How? Where is God? The circumstances of life made you bitter. Naomi said, call me Mara, call me bitter, for the circumstances of life have made me bitter. And if so, how have you responded to that bitterness? Have you given your sorrows to God? Do we look to God and say, I don't understand, but I look to you? It's my source of hope. It's my source of help. It's the one to whom I run. And my third question here, it says, do you trust that God is with you even in the dark and difficult valleys of life? Doesn't mean they make sense to us. But are we looking to God to say, you are with me? I promise you read this and you see Naomi doesn't feel the presence of God here. She doesn't seem to be uplifted and encouraged. She's bitter. She's in sorrow and pain. But as we see, God is still working, even when she doesn't see it. So do you trust that God is with you even in the dark and difficult valleys of life? And then my fourth question is, like Naomi, do you continue to move toward God and His people even when you do not understand your circumstances? In the midst of this brokenness, she goes home to the people of God, to God Himself. And so, do you in the same way? Do you move towards the people of God? So often we isolate ourselves when challenges come. We say, I don't want to be around Christians right now. I don't want to have to talk about this. Let me just isolate myself. But instead, do you move toward God and His people even when you do not understand? And my final question is for anyone that's not a Christian. In many ways, going back to the main point of this whole passage, will you follow God like Ruth or try to survive some other way? If you're not a Christian and you're watching online or you're here, the question is, we can try it some other way. But I'm of the opinion, I don't think you're going to find hope any other way other than through God and God alone. And God is oftentimes most present in our lives when we find ourselves in the midst of pain and sorrow and difficulty. So if you're not a Christian, will you follow God or try it another way? So if you'd like to hear more about what it means to be a Christian, I'd love to talk with you about that. Email me, talk to me about that. We have a God that is with us in the midst of pain. And as we'll see through the rest of this story in the coming weeks, there's much to celebrate as we see how God actually works in the midst of this brokenness and pain. So let's take hope in that now. Let's pray together.